Part 1, Chapter 16 of the Daisy Chain. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Nancy Cochran Gergen, Gilbert, Arizona. The Daisy Chain by Charlotte Mary Yonge, Part 1, Chapter 16. Evans. Peace to your tattlings. What is fair, William? William. Vulture. Quickly. Polecats. There are fairer things than polecats, sure. Evans. I pray you have your remembrance, child, accusative. Hing, hang, hog. Quickly. Hang hog is Latin for bacon, I warrant you. Shakespeare. In a large family it must often happen that since every member of it cannot ride the same hobby, nor at the same time, their several steeds must sometimes run counter to each other, and so Ethel found it one morning when Miss Winter, having a bad cold, had given her an unwonted holiday. Mr. Wilmot had sent a large parcel of books for her to choose from for Coxmore, but this she could not well do without consultation. The multitude bewildered her, she was afraid of taking too many or too few, and the being brought to these practical details made her sensible that though her schemes were very grand and full for future doings, they passed very lightly over the intermediate ground. The Paulo post fullum was a period much more developed in her imagination than the future that the present was flowing into. Where was her coadjutor, Richard? Writing notes for papa and not to be disturbed. She had better have waited tranquilly, but this would not suit her impatience, and she ran up to Margaret's room. There she found a great display of ivy leaves, which Norman, who had been turning half the shops in the town upside down in search of materials, was instructing her to imitate in leather work, a regular mania with him, and apparently the same with Margaret. In came Ethel. "Oh, Margaret, will you look at these first truths? Do you think they would be easy enough? Shall I take some of the parables and miracles at once, or content myself with the book about Jane Sparks?" "There's some very easy reading in Jane Sparks, isn't there? I would not make the little books from the New Testament too common." "Take care that leaf has 5 points," said Norman. "Shall I bring you up Jane Sparks to see? Because then you can judge," said Ethel. "There, Norman, is that right? What a beauty! I should like to look over them by and by, dear Ethel, very much." Ethel gazed and went away, more put out than was usual with her. When Margaret has a new kind of fancy work, she thought, she cares for nothing else. As if my poor children did not signify more than trumpery leather leaves. She next met Flora. "Oh, Flora, see here! What a famous parcel of books Mr. Wilmot has sent us to choose from." "All those?" said Flora, turning them over as they lay heaped on the drawing-room sofa. "What a confusion! See, such a parcel of reading books. I want to know what you think of setting them up with Jane Sparks, as it is week-day teaching. You will be very tired of hearing those spelled over forever. They have some nicer books at the National School. What is the name of them? Do you see any of them here?" "No, I don't think I do, but I can't wait to look now. I must write some letters. You had better put them together a little. If you were to sort them, you would know what is there. Now, what a mess they are in." Ethel could not deny it, and began to deal them out in piles, looking somewhat more fitting, but still felt neglected and aggrieved at no one being at leisure but Harry, who was not likely to be of any use to her. Presently she heard the study door open, and hoped, but though it was Richard who entered the room, he was followed by Tom, and each held various books that boded little good to her. Miss Winter had, much to her own satisfaction, been relieved from the charge of Tom, whose lessons Richard had taken upon himself, and thus Ethel had heard so little about them for a long time past, that even in her vexation and desire to have them over, she listened with interest, desirous to judge what sort of place Tom might be likely to take in school. She did not perceive that this made Richard nervous and uneasy. He had a great dislike to spectators of Latin lessons. He never had forgotten an unlucky occasion, some years back, when his father was examining him in the Georgics, and he, dull by nature, and duller by confusion and timidity, had gone on rendering word for word, enim for, sagus a crop, leni of mud, urit burns, campum the field, avene a crop of pipe, urit burns it. When Norman and Ethel had first warned him of the beauty of his translation by an explosion of laughing, when his father had shut the book with a bounce, shaken his head in utter despair, and told him to give up all thoughts of doing anything, and when Margaret had cried with vexation. Since that time he had never been happy when any one was in earshot of a lesson. But today he had no escape. Harry lay on the rug reading, and Ethel sat forlorn over her books on the sofa. Tom, however, was bright enough, declined his Greek nouns irreproachably, and construed his Latin so well that Ethel could not help putting in a word or two of commendation, and auguring the third form. "Do let him off the parsing, Rachie," said she coaxingly. "He has said it so well, and I want you so much." "I am afraid I must not," said Richard, who, to her surprise, did not look pleased or satisfied with the prosperous translation. "But come, Tom, you shan't have many words if you really know them." Tom twisted and looked rather cross, but when asked to parse the word viribus, answered readily and correctly. "Very well, only two more. Affuit, third person singular, praeterperfect tense of the verb affo, affis, affui, affere," gabbled off Tom with such confidence that though Ethel gave an indignant jump, Richard was almost startled into letting it pass, and disbelieving himself. He remonstrated in a somewhat hesitating voice. "Did you find that in the dictionary?" said he. "I thought affui came from adsum." "Oh, to be sure. Stupid fool of a word, so it does," said Tom hastily. "I had forgot. Adsum, ads, affui, ades." Richard said no more, but proposed the word oppositus, adjective. Ethel was surprised, for she remembered that it was, in this passage, part of a passive verb, which Tom had construed correctly. It was objected, and she had thought this very creditable to him, whereas he now evidently took it for opposite. However, on Richard's reading the line, he corrected himself and called it a participle, but did not commit himself further till asked for its derivation. "From oppositor." "Hello!" cried Harry, who hitherto had been abstracted in his book, but now turned, raised himself on his elbow, and, at the blunder, shook his thick yellow locks and showed his teeth like a yellow lion. "No, now, Tom, pay attention," said Richard, resignedly. "If you found out its meaning, you must have seen its derivation." "Oppositus," said Tom, twisting his fingers and gazing first at Ethel, then at Harry, in hopes of being prompted, then at the ceiling and floor, the while he drawled out the word with a whine: "Why, oppositus, from opposor." "Opposer, ain't it?" said Harry. "Don't, Harry, you distract him," said Richard. "Come, Tom, say at once whether you know it or not. It is of no use to invent." "From op," and a mumble. "What? I don't hear op?" Tom again looked for help to Harry, who made a mischievous movement of his lips, as if prompting, and, deceived by it, he said boldly: "From opossum." "That's right. Let us hear him decline it," cried Harry in an ecstasy. "Opossum, opotus, opossy, or pottery?" "Harry," said Richard in a gentle, reasonable voice, "I wish you would be so kind as not to stay if you cannot help distracting him." And Harry, who really had a tolerable share of forbearance and consideration, actually obeyed, contenting himself with tossing his book into the air and catching it again, while he paused at the door to give his last unsolicited assistance. "Decline opossum, you say? I'll tell you how. Opossum reposes up a gum tree. Pot you I will, says the posse of Yankees, come out to catch him. Opossum poses them and declines in opotes by any manner of means of opotting do dum, was quite oppositum, opotitu, in fact, quite contrary. Richard, with the gravity of a victim, heard this sally of schoolboy wit, which threw Ethel back on the sofa in fits of laughing, and declaring that the opossum declined, not that he was declined. But in the midst of the disturbance thus created, Tom stepped up to her and whispered: "Do tell me, Ethel." "Indeed I shan't," said she. "Why don't you say fairly if you don't know?" He was obliged to confess his ignorance, and Richard made him conjugate the whole verb opponer from beginning to end, in which he wanted a good deal of help. Ethel could not help saying: "How did you find out the meaning of that word, Tom, if you didn't look out the verb?" "I don't know," drawled Tom, in the voice, half sullen, half piteous, which he always assumed when out of sorts. "It is very odd," she said, decidedly, but Richard took no notice and proceeded to the other lessons, which went off tolerably well, except the arithmetic, where there was some great misunderstanding, into which Ethel did not enter for some time. When she did attend she perceived that Tom had brought a right answer, without understanding the working of the sum, and that Richard was putting him through it. She began to be worked into a state of dismay and indignation at Tom's behaviour, and Richard's calm indifference, which made her almost forget Jane Sparks, and long to be alone with Richard. But all the world kept coming into the room and going out, and she could not say what was in her mind till after dinner, when, seeing Richard go up into Margaret's room, she ran after him, and entering it, surprised Margaret by not beginning on her books, but saying at once: "Richie, I wanted to speak to you about Tom. I am sure he shuffled about those lessons." "I am afraid he does," said Richard, much concerned. "What, do you mean that it is often so?" "Much too often," said Richard, "but I have never been able to detect him. He is very sharp, and has some underhand way of preparing his lessons that I cannot make out." "Did you know it, Margaret?" said Ethel, astonished not to see her sister look shocked as well as sorry. "Yes," said Margaret. "Richie and I have often talked it over, and tried to think what was to be done." "Dear me, why don't you tell papa? It is such a terrible thing." "So it is," said Margaret, "but we have nothing positive or tangible to accuse Tom of. We don't know what he does, and have never caught him out. I am sure he must have found out the meaning of that oppositum in some wrong way. If he had looked it out, he would only have found opposite. Nothing but opponer could have shown him the rendering which he made." "That's like what I have said almost every day," said Richard. "But there we are, I can't get any further." "Perhaps he guesses by the context," said Margaret. "It would be impossible to do so always," said both the Latin scholars at once. "Well, I can't think how you can take it so quietly," said Ethel. "I would have told papa the first moment, and put a stop to it. I have a great mind to do so, if you won't." "Ethel, Ethel, that would never do!" exclaimed Margaret. "Pray don't. Papa would be so dreadfully grieved and angry with poor Tom." "Well, so he deserves," said Ethel. "You don't know what it is to see papa angry," said Richard. "Dear me, Richard," cried Ethel, who thought she knew pretty well what his sharp words were. "I'm sure papa never was very angry with me without making me love him more, and, at least, want to be better." "You are a girl," said Richard. "You are higher spirited and shake off things faster," said Margaret. "Why, what do you think he would do to Tom?" "I think he would be so very angry that Tom, who, you know, is timid and meek, would be dreadfully frightened," said Richard. "That's just what he ought to be, frightened out of these tricks." "I am afraid it would frighten him into them still more," said Richard, "and perhaps give him such a dread of my father as would ever prevent him from ever being open with him." "Besides, it would make papa so very unhappy," added Margaret. "Of course, if poor Tom had been found out in any positive deceit, we ought to mention it at once, and let him be punished, but while it is all vague suspicion, and of what papa has such a horror of, it would only grieve him and make him constantly anxious without, perhaps, doing Tom any good." "I think all that is expediency," said Ethel, in her bluff, abrupt way. "Besides," said Richard, "we have nothing positive to accuse him of, and if we had, it would be of no use. He will be at school in 3 weeks, and there he would be sure to shirk even if he left it off here. Everyone does, and thinks nothing of it." "Richard!" cried both sisters, shocked. "You never did?" "No, we didn't, but most others do, and not bad fellows either. It is not the way of boys to think much of those things." "It is mean. It is dishonourable. It is deceitful!" cried Ethel. "I know it is very wrong, but you'll never get the general run of boys to think so," said Richard. "Then Tom ought not to go to school at all till he is well armed against it," said Ethel. "That can't be helped," said Richard. "He will get clear of it in time, when he knows better." "I will talk to him," said Margaret, "and, indeed, I think it would be better than worrying papa." "Well," said Ethel, "of course I shan't tell, because it is not my business, but I think papa ought to know everything about us, and I don't like your keeping anything back. It is being almost as bad as Tom himself." With which words, as Flora entered, Ethel marched out of the room in displeasure and went down, resolved to settle Jane Sparks by herself. "Ethel is out of sorts to day," said Flora. "What's the matter?" "We have had a discussion," said Margaret. "She has been terribly shocked by finding out what we often thought about poor little Tom, and she thinks we ought to tell papa. Her principle is quite right, but I doubt " "I know exactly how Ethel would do it," cried Flora. "Blurt out all on a sudden. 'Papa, Tom cheats at his lessons!' Then there would be a tremendous uproar, papa would scold Tom till he almost frightened him out of his wits, and then find out it was only suspicion." "And never have any comfort again," said Margaret. "He would always dread that Tom was deceiving him, and then think it was all for want of Oh, no, it will never do to speak of it, unless we find out some positive piece of misbehaviour." "Certainly," said Flora. "And it would do Tom no good to make him afraid of papa," said Richard. "Ethel's rule is right in principle," said Margaret thoughtfully, "that papa ought to know all without reserve. And yet it will hardly do in practice. One must use discretion, and not tease him about every little thing. He takes them so much to heart that he would be almost distracted. And, with so much business abroad, I think at home he should have nothing but rest, and, as far as we can, freedom from care and worry. Anything wrong about the children brings on the grief so much that I cannot bear to mention it." Richard and Flora agreed with her, admiring the spirit which made her, in her weakness and helplessness, bear the whole burden of family cares alone, and devote herself entirely to spare her father. He was, indeed, her first object, and she would have sacrificed anything to give him ease of mind; but, perhaps, she regarded him more as a charge of her own than as, in very truth, the head of the family. She had the government in her hands, and had never been used to see him exercise it much in detail. She did not know how much her mother had referred to him in private, and had succeeded to her authority at a time when his health and spirits were in such a state as to make it doubly needful to spare him. It was no wonder that she sometimes carried her consideration beyond what was strictly right, and forgot that he was the real authority, more especially as his impulsive nature sometimes carried him away, and his sound judgment was not certain to come into play at the first moment, so that it required some moral courage to excite displeasure, so easy of manifestation, and of such courage there was perhaps a deficiency in her character. Nor had she yet detected her own satisfaction in being the first with every one in the family. Ethel was put out, as Flora had discovered, and when she was downstairs she found it out and accused herself of having been cross to Margaret and unkind to Tom, of wishing to be a tell-tale. But still, though displeased with herself, she was dissatisfied with Margaret. It might be right, but it did not agree with her notions. She wanted to see every one uncompromising, as girls of 15 generally do. She had an intense disgust and loathing of underhand ways, could not bear to think of Tom's carrying them on, and going to a place of temptation with them uncorrected, and she looked up to her father with the reverence and enthusiasm of one like-minded. She was vexed on another score. Norman came home from Abbotstoke Grange without having seen Miss Rivers, but with a fresh basket of choice flowers, rapturous descriptions of Mr. Rivers's prints, and a present of an engraving, in shading, such as to give the effect of a cast, of a very fine head of Alexander. Nothing was to be thought of but a frame for this, olive, bay, laurel, everything appropriate to the conqueror. Margaret and Norman were engrossed in the subject, and, to Ethel, who had no toleration for fancy work, who expected everything to be either useful or intellectual, this seemed very frivolous. She heard her father say how glad he was to see Norman interested and occupied, and certainly, though it was only in leather leaves, it was better than drooping and attending to nothing. She knew, too, that Margaret did it for his sake, but, said Ethel to herself, it was very odd that people should find amusement in such things. Margaret always had a turn for them, but it was very strange in Norman. Then came the pang of finding out that this was aggravated by the neglect of herself. She called it all selfishness, and felt that she had had an uncomfortable, unsatisfactory day with everything going wrong. End of Part 1, Chapter 16. Recording by Nancy Cochran Gergen, Gilbert, Arizona.